and welcome to the Introduction to the Science of Reading. I'm joined today by Judy Bowling, who is both a library and an instructional technology consultant here at Wayne Risa. I'm excited to have her with me because Judy is actually in charge of the library, which when you think of the science of reading, you know just how important research is, and Judy is my go-to for all things research. So if you're having trouble finding something or you need more research on a topic, please reach out to her. She is amazing. And I am Michelle Wagner, a literacy consultant. Before we begin, I would like to encourage you to grab 2 tools for learning. One is just something to write with, and 2 is something to write on. As I was preparing for today's session, I fell down a bit of a rabbit hole in terms of trying to find both the most pertinent pieces of information to share with you, and then also trying to find the best ways to help everyone who may be tuning in to remember those important parts. I ended up reading an article in Psychology Today by Dr. Tad Waddington, and I thought I'd share a bit of what Dr. Waddington concluded based on research on how humans remember information. Some of Dr. Waddington's findings are pretty obvious. For example, we tend to remember things right after we hear them. So if you think about learning something new, like a person's name, as soon as they tell you their name, you usually remember that name in that moment. It's when the conversation ends and you move away and time passes that you really forget maybe what you learned or what you heard. It turns out that there are actual patterns for forgetting. So there's a drop off of what we will remember after 60 minutes, and then again after 24 hours. Those are the times when we tend to forget the most. So we'll remember a little more at an hour and a little bit less at 24 hours. We want to interrupt that pattern of forgetting. In order to interrupt that, I'm going to give you a challenge. So as you think about your tools for learning, I would like to ask that you number 1 through 3. And as we go through today's session, perhaps find 3 pieces of information that you think would be valuable for you as a professional. Something that you think might be applicable to your position in the fall, something that you thought was interesting, or something that you wanted to delve into deeper. 3 pieces of interesting information. And then as you write those down, I would challenge you to really think back on those pieces in an hour after our session is over. And then again, tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon, as you're getting ready for your day, perhaps just look at that information that you jotted down one more time, and we can disrupt that pattern of forgetting. Let's dive right into our topic, Introduction to the Science of Reading. Today's session is meant to be an overview. Much of what I'm going to share today will probably be review for you. Maybe it's been a while since you've heard it, or you're starting to wonder, hey, I'm starting to hear the term science of reading. Do I know what that is? And you're questioning. Just giving you a quick overview of some of the basic concepts. Hopefully you're making connections as you're listening to things that you've already learned and heard. I do want to acknowledge that there seems to be almost this tension between the science of reading and maybe other types of literacy instruction that you might be familiar with. So it almost seems at times like there's this battle between balanced literacy and science of reading, or science of reading and another piece that you may have been implementing in your classroom. So what I really want to do is I do want to acknowledge that, but I want to also say that I'm hoping that today's session really dispels some of this, because I think we're all talking about the same kinds of things, and there might be some nuances in what we're doing that need to be tweaked, but we don't want to judge too harshly until we understand exactly what's happening in a classroom, and then also what we mean by the science of reading. As we think about our literacy instruction, I hope that we're being responsive in all that we do. And then we're really not trying to make a stand one way or another. Instead, it's that we want to make sure that every child has access to high quality literacy instruction that is based on research. We want to make sure that whatever we're doing in our classroom is structured and balanced in a way that is culturally responsive and specifically designed for the children in your unique classroom. And the only way to do that is to really think about the whole child. I want to give you just a moment to read this quote from A Nation at Risk to a Nation at Hope. And hopefully, as you're reading that quote, you are finding yourself in agreement. We can't just focus on the academic. We must look at the whole child. We must make sure that we're promoting social, emotional, and academic learning for those children so that we're taking care of the whole child. And if the whole child is our focus, then we are going to want to apply research because applying research is good for the whole child. When we think about looking at the most up-to-date research on literacy instruction, we know that we're doing what's best for children if we're applying those practices in our classroom. It seems sometimes that this idea of science of reading is brand new, like it's some sort of breaking news that we've never thought of before. And that's not really true. It doesn't matter that textbooks might be starting to put stickers on the front of their books to say that they're based on the science of reading or that they're science of reading compatible. It's not a new term. It's not a new idea. But what exactly is it? What does it mean when we say science of reading? And this is a really important question because sometimes there are feelings associated with a term or a phrase. And we want to make sure that if we're feeling a certain way, that we understand exactly what it is. And we may need to define that. Unfortunately, when we think of the science of reading, there is no one answer. Dr. Nell Duke has pointed out multiple times that when you want to know the definition of science of reading, it really depends on who you ask and who you're talking to. So let me give you an example of this. If you would just take a moment to put into the chat what you think of when you hear the word autumn. All right, those responses are coming in. I'm seeing cold, I saw wet, dark days, lots of positives, colors, beautiful, back to school, crisp air, beauty, leaves. Oh, I see so much. Awesome. Did notice is that there were differences in what we responded. Even though we are a collection of educators, most of us, or maybe all of us from Michigan, we all have the same evidence to work with, but our answers were quite different. Some of us thought of autumn and thought of some things that were a little messy, maybe the dark days or the puddles and the rain, while others saw the beauty and the magical colors of autumn. Neither response was wrong, but we both used the evidence that we had to really put forth an answer. So sometimes we can have an idea that is defined differently depending on who you ask. And that's just an important thing to note whenever you're talking about any topic. And this is where I would always recommend that you go back to the research so that you can make your own conclusions. It's very important that we have a common definition when we are discussing the science of reading. So for the purposes of today, I will be using the definition created by whatisthescienceofreading.org. And I will be using this so that when I speak of the science of reading, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and issues related to reading and writing. So really any research that's done on literacy is what I mean by the science of reading. And clearly, as research evolves, as we learn more, my positions and my understandings may change as all of us will. That's how science works. As we find out new information, we change and shift. So we want to look at the most current research, and we also want to be very careful that we're not just looking at a single study that might be done in isolation or done by a vendor or a product creator, because we want to make sure that we're getting real unbiased research. One of the books that I've been diving into this summer is No More Independent Reading Without Support by Barbara Moss. And as I was reading this text, she included a story that I think is relevant to our work today. I just wanted to take a moment to read that story to you. The author of No More Independent Reading Without Support is actually sharing a tale by Eduardo Galileo, a short story that he wrote called Bureaucracy 3. And this is what he writes. At a barracks in Seville, in the middle of the courtyard of that barracks was a small bench. Next to the small bench, a soldier stood guard. No one knew why the bench had to be guarded. It was guarded around the clock, every day, every night, and from one generation of officers to the next. The order was sent, and the soldiers obeyed it. No one expressed any doubts or ever asked why. If that's how it was done, there had to be a reason. And so it continued until someone, some general or colonel, wanted to look at the original order. He had to rummage through all the files. After a good bit of poking around, he found the answer. 31 years, 2 months, and 4 days ago, an officer had ordered that a guard stand beside the bench, which had just been painted, so that no one would think of sitting on wet paint. Now, the story of the bench clearly is an extreme anecdote. But are there some benches in our own education, in our own teaching, that we may need to let go of? We may need to stop guarding. Perhaps the reason why we initially started doing them just doesn't exist anymore. When we think about those things that we might not need to keep doing in our classrooms or that we might want to step up in our classrooms, one great place to go is Google Scholar. Like all things Google, they make it easy for us to find their products. So it's scholar.google.com. And what you'll be able to do at Google Scholar is to actually put in topics and find current research on them. So you can decide who you want to search by author or by topic. You can put in parameters regarding the date of the study. So if you're looking for more recent information, it's easy to find that as well. So I'd highly encourage you to start with Google Scholar whenever you're thinking about, hey, I wonder if this practice is something I should continue. I also want to encourage you again to reach out to Judy Bowling. So I know she'll put her email in the chat, but she is such a great resource for finding information. And if you can't find it on Google Scholar or you're struggling, reach out to her. She always has some great tips to help you find that information. So let's dive into a few basics about the science of reading. The first piece that I want to cover is this idea of the simple view of reading. I have to say, this may be the worst name for something ever because it's not really simple. It's just that the formula itself is simple. So what is the simple view of reading? Well, basically, it's that the product of decoding and listening comprehension is reading comprehension. I'll say that again, that the product of decoding and listening comprehension is reading comprehension. So this came about in 1986 by Goff and Tunmer, and it's actually been revised since then. In 2020, Hubner and Tunner re-released the simple view of reading, and they made a couple of changes. So instead of decoding, they said word recognition, and instead of listening comprehension, it's language comprehension. So the product of word recognition and language comprehension is reading comprehension. I made sure to put that it had been revised for a few reasons. One is that sometimes we believe that the research on reading has been around for so long and nothing's changing, and that's not really true. Even the simple view of reading has been revised, and we would hope that, right? I wouldn't want to go to a doctor who was using all the same medical practices from 1986 because a lot has changed. In 1986, we didn't even have computers in most homes. So this is a different world. So it is obvious that there would be changes. It's an example of just a slight change. There's also something called the 4-part processing model. I'll give you a second to look at this graphic in case this is maybe the first time you've heard that term. And now we'll just take a moment to really go through that. Let's start with the orthographic. This is where you actually look at the letters, so you see the letters on the page. Then we move to the phonological processing system. That's where we transfer that letter into a sound, which means that the child has to remember the sound within a word and in the correct order. Once they can do that, clearly they have to use phonics to sound it out or stretch out those sounds. From there, the student will need to access his or her mental dictionary of word meanings before eventually determining the meaning of the word based on the context that the word appears. This may seem like a lot if this is the first time you're seeing this, or you may be wondering, but it does really make sense, the way all of these 4 systems work together in order to read and comprehend a passage. It may also be familiar to you if you were familiar with the MSV model. I have here a diagram from Shifting the Balance by Berkins and Yates that really shows some of the connections. So if you're familiar with the MSV structure, hopefully you're making a lot of connections between what I just showed in the 4-part processing model. So when we think about meaning, that first bubble on the left, the M represents meaning, where the contextual supports a reader might draw on in order to figure out an unknown word. This is where students would use background knowledge, picture clues, vocabulary, even their familiarity with different story structures in order to determine meaning. The S in the MSV model represents structure or the syntactical information in the text that the student uses to figure out what a word means. This is where you might use what you know about grammar or word order in order to determine meaning. Teachers who are helping students with this particular piece might ask students, does that sound right? And then you have the V, the visual. This is the orthographic information like letters and letter patterns that students would use. Now, the criticism of this is that you don't necessarily see phonological or phonics here. However, if you're a proponent of the MSV model, what you would probably say is, hey, the phonological processing system is everywhere. So when we think about the meaning component, of this MSV model, that really harkens back to the meaning and context processing systems in the four-part processor. With structure, again, meaning and context processing systems, and then the visual really harkens to that orthographic processing system. So the piece that's really missing from the four-part processing model is that phonological processing system. What I think people who use this model would argue is that that's really embedded in each piece. If we think about the four-part processing model, it reminds us that high quality reading instruction should be comprehensive, holistic, and that all the parts fit together and differentiated based on the needs of each child. And then also, what really matters is that we're looking at where students are having difficulty. If they're having difficulty with one of the processing systems, that we're prompting them in such a way that they're experiencing success. Dr. Duke, you'll hear me mentioning Dr. Nell Duke quite a bit. I really respect her work, and she's a great researcher in the field of early literacy, has created this list of prompts that we can use to prompt students as they read. You'll notice that they're very kid-friendly and should be easy to use. So I'll make sure I include a link for you in the chat. Really, each of these processing systems must work together in order for a child to read. So the purpose of using those prompts would be to make sure that the child is able to access each of those processing systems in a way that helps them read comprehensively. So let's go back to the simple view of reading and really start to connect the pieces as we go. So when we talk about the four processing systems, all of those pieces help in word recognition, which you may remember is one of the pieces of a simple view of reading. When we think about language comprehension, we're speaking specifically about context and meaning, and those fit right into that language comprehension. Even though these ideas may seem separate, everything's connected. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that our ultimate goal for all things reading is comprehension. And no one knows this better than early elementary teachers, but we must also remember to differentiate instruction in order to meet the needs of every child. All right, we'll shift gears a little bit more. We're going to talk about Scarborough's rope. So I'm going to give you just a moment to look at the rope. Let's really dive into this rope. You can see that there are two main pieces, two main parts of the rope. The first being language comprehension. And language comprehension is made up of individual strands, including background knowledge, vocabulary, language structure, verbal reasoning, which deals with understanding figurative language, literacy knowledge, which takes into account things like concepts of print, understanding of genres. And then we have word recognition. And when we think about word recognition, we're talking about phonological awareness, decoding skills, being able to recognize words by sight, that sight recognition part. And you'll notice that as a student becomes better and better at each one of these, as they build their skills, the rope becomes tighter. So they weave together until they weave together into a tight rope that really does represent skilled reading. Let's take a moment to really look at some research to see if anything's changed since Scarborough's rope was initially released. And what we find is that in 2021, Dr. Nell Duke and Dr. Cartwright developed the active view of reading, which builds on Scarborough's rope. This may be the first time you're seeing Dr. Duke's model, so I want to give you a moment just to take a look. I want to just walk through this model and hopefully just take a deeper look at each of the pieces. So as you're comparing this to Scarborough's rope, hopefully the first thing you notice, other than it's not a rope, is that we have that green bubble that represents something that we didn't really see in Scarborough's rope, that idea of active self-regulation. So as teachers, you know that motivation and engagement have a huge impact on whether or not a child will comprehend the text. And we can even take an adult example of this. If you ever read a page in a book or on an article or something where you're thinking about something else and you get to the end of that page or that article and you're like, I have no idea what I just read. That's an example of a time when you were engaged in what you were reading. Your mind was reading the words, but you don't remember what it said. You don't comprehend what it meant. So the motivation and engagement part does affect whether or not a child will comprehend the text. Also, our ability to monitor how we're reading and what we're reading, to keep track of ourselves, and our use of strategies can make a difference in whether or not we're able to read a text. So I think about those strategies. I'm thinking about word recognition strategies, comprehension strategies, vocabulary strategies, anything that we use to help us understand what we're reading. That idea feeds into these others. You'll also notice that there are some pieces that are very similar. So that idea of word recognition, phonological awareness, the alphabetic principle, understanding that letters have sounds associated with them, our phonics knowledge, our decoding skills, and recognition of words at sight. And then we also at the bottom have those language comprehension skills. This is where we apply our cultural and other content knowledge, our reading specific background knowledge, verbal reasoning. Again, this is those understanding of figurative language. And then theory of mind, which is understanding your own state of mind when you read, and then also understanding what others may be thinking or feeling as you read the text. But there are also these bridging processes. So those bridging processes fall into both categories. So let's start with print concepts. That's the understanding of how print works, such as reading it from left to right and top to bottom in the English language. Then we have reading fluency, which is the accuracy, the automaticity, and the prosody with which a person reads. Our vocabulary knowledge, which is understanding of words and phrases within our language. Morphological awareness, which is understanding of those small, meaningful units of language, so such as those prefixes and suffixes. And then here's our $1 million word for the day, graphophonological somatic cognitive flexibility, which is really our ability to simultaneously consider and actively switch between the letter sound and meaning features of printed words. So being able to sound out a word and think about the meaning at the same time. And all of those pieces, if we put them together, will result in reading and being able to comprehend what we read. That's the active view of reading in a nutshell. If I had to say the three big takeaways, the three big pieces that may have changed since Scarborough's wrote, that word recognition and language comprehension are not the only causes of reading difficulty. And this is where we go back to that motivation and engagement part. That's an easy example. Also, there is considerable overlap between the processes that make word recognition and language comprehension possible when reading. So they're not necessarily separate strands. They're more woven together already that we have to put them together at the same time. And then finally, the active self-regulation plays an important role in reading. At this time, please select which of the following options you would like to start with. Would you like to view a short video clip by Dr. Nell Duke, where she shares what the science of reading means and specifically connects it to the essential instructional practices in early literacy? Or would you prefer to read one of her articles on the science of reading? Wonderful. Let's take a moment to really dive into one of these articles. Before you select which article you would like to read, I'd like to give you an opportunity to at least preview each of them. Your first choice is to read The Science of Reading Comprehension Instruction by Duke, Ward, and Pearson. Take a moment to read this excerpt. Your next choice is The Science of Reading Progresses, Communicating Advances Beyond the Simple View of Reading by Duke and Cartwright. For this, I've actually included the abstract, so I'll give you just a few minutes to read that. Based on what you've previewed, please select one of the two articles to read deeper. As you're reading the articles, I would ask that you look for a quote that sticks out to you or a word or phrase that resonates with you. Just highlight those as you go to help you focus on really what stands out to you as you're reading. Let's share a quote by Harry Truman, President Truman. "Not all readers are leaders, but all leaders are readers." And we will hear from Nell Duke. A little bit of background about who she's talking to. In this video, she's actually sharing this information with a group of literacy coaches from around the state. And it's in that the question just kept coming up about, but what does the science of reading mean? Or I don't know if we're talking about the same thing. That was kind of the theme of the comments beforehand. It was that sometimes it has different meanings. So here we go.
The basic answer is it depends on who you ask. There's not one definition of science of reading that everyone holds. I think that if we're just talking about researchers, okay, and remember what a researcher is. A researcher is a person whose daily work involves asking research questions and systematically collecting and analyzing data to answer those questions. That's what a researcher is. Researchers ask questions that could be answered in many different ways. That is they don't already know the answer. And then, they let the data and the analysis of the data help them to figure out the answer to the question. So that's basically what a researcher is. So nearly all researchers agree that the science of reading is a term, at least my perception is, that nearly all researchers agree that the science of reading is a term for a body of findings from research about reading processes and also about reading instruction. Okay. These findings include, but are absolutely not limited to, phonemic awareness, phonics, and word reading development. So that was one of the emails that we got in response to our query to all of you, was, really allude to this perception that the science of reading is just about word reading. It is not. That is not correct. There is research on many different aspects of reading development, and research or instruction aligned with a science of reading would address, absolutely address phonemic awareness, phonics, and word reading development in early schooling, but it would also address other things. One of the emphases that you tend to see in researchers' conversations about the science of reading is an emphasis on converging findings. You see that emphasis in some other conversations as well, but not necessarily consistently. So often what researchers are looking for is, well, did a whole bunch of studies align to kind of show us the same thing? We tend to get real nervous as researchers about like one study. We don't like to make a lot of claims about one study. We tend to like to have a bunch of studies, and we tend to like when those studies, we tend to emphasize when those studies have come to a similar conclusion. In the research community, there is a lot of agreement about which findings converge. I would say in the research community, we agree on more than we disagree about, but there's definitely not universal agreement, just as there isn't in public health or in, astrophysics or in any academic discipline. So there's not universal agreement. There's a lot of agreement among researchers. Often where the agreement gets to be less is the more people are in the conversation, right? So that's, you could think about that being true of lots of topics. Let's just take a topic that's in the news and very a subject of a lot of discourse right now, vaccination. There's a lot of agreement if you define the set of people one way, but if you are including everybody's thoughts, then there's much less agreement. So that's, I think, true here as well. Where I would say that there's less agreement even within the research community right now, I think the research community is sorting out which research methodologies actually contribute to the science of reading. And if you heard my May presentation, you heard me explain that the website whatisthescienceofreading.org, which I'll share in a minute, you might remember that I showed you and talked about the fact that that website said that the science of reading is just experimental and quasi-experimental studies, and that a large group of researchers, I was part of the reading forum, doesn't think that that's true. So I actually met with the what is the science of reading.org coalition, made my case, and they have since revised the definition that they present. So I'll show you in a minute that they're now including a wider range of research methodologies, which is exciting to me. There are definitely differences also, I would say, from researcher to researcher, from organization to organization, and sort of which disciplines of research are more foregrounded. So some folks really foreground like neuroscience, but don't pay very much attention to randomized controlled trials that are done in classrooms or in schools or districts. Other scholars tend to put those randomized controlled trials that are done in classrooms and districts like really up front, that they really foreground those, and they spend less time talking about things like maybe basic cognitive psychological research. So that's another way where there are some differences. But the bottom line that I want you to take from this is are the following, that this is an old term. It's been around a long time. It's not a new thing. Okay. And two, that there's quite a bit of agreement among researchers, not universal agreement, but quite a bit of agreement about the science of reading as being a term to reflect converging findings across lots of different research studies, including studies of different methodologies and different disciplines.
Great. So hopefully that was helpful for you to hear from Dr. Duke. I personally am a fan of Dr. Duke's work. She does a lot on in terms of researching early literacy, and I highly recommend that you follow her on Twitter if you're on Twitter, but definitely when you're searching Google Scholar that you put her name in. She's done a lot when it comes to just helping us better understand research. She's also, if you've had the chance to see her, she was at MRA last year. She's really funny. Encourage you, if you own this book or if you're interested in this, to pick up a copy. Basically, the purpose of this experiment was to determine how situational variables, specifically added pressure, impact a person's willingness to help someone in need. A group of seminary students were asked to travel across their college campus to give a talk. The professors in charge of the study hired an actor to lie in the alley, slumped over as if he had been beaten or robbed or hurt in some way. The seminary students would have to pass by the actor in order to get across the campus. So this actor was situated in such a way where he could not be missed. As the experiment progressed, the professors added a bit more pressure to each group of seminary students to see how their behavior of each group would change. One group had a lot of pressure. You're late. They were expecting you a few minutes ago. Hurry. Another group had medium pressure. The assistant is ready. Please head over there now. And the final group had only a little bit of pressure added to them. They'll be ready for you in a few minutes. Feel free to head over now. You can see kind of the different levels of pressure there. When there was low pressure, 63% of the students stopped to help the man. When there was medium pressure, 45% of them stopped to help the person in distress. When there was high pressure, only 10% of the students stopped. Some in the high pressure group actually stepped right over the man who needed help in order to get where they were headed. So I think about this, and we must assume that each of these students were probably pretty decent people. I mean, they were all pursuing careers in ministry, but they still acted quite differently based on the amount of pressure placed on them. I share that story because we know that the need for all children to receive high quality literacy instruction is urgent. And as educators, that burden, that urgency is laid at your feet or on your shoulders as it is sometimes. I just want to make sure that even though it is urgent, that we're taking a moment to really reflect on who might need our help. Is there anybody we might be not seeing, stepping around, stepping over, while we try and reach our goals? And so is there anyone who needs our help? I say this all the time, that we have to be mindful of those students that we teach, and no one does this better, in my opinion, than early elementary teachers. Early elementary teachers get to know their students in a way that is unparalleled. But I think we all need to really reflect on who needs our help and differentiate our instruction in order to meet those needs. As we wrap up, as we end our time together, learning to read is not magic. There is a science in the way that students learn how to read. It's more than just connecting students with a book that they like or a text that they want to read. There's more to it than that. They have to be able to decode words. They have to be able to apply phonics skills. We have to make sure that we're giving them those skills. And of course, they do also have to have access to books they can and want to read. That the literacy essentials, when we think about the science of reading, the literacy essentials are the science of reading. They are built upon the science of reading. They are not two different ideas. They are the same. They're both based on research. And then if you're familiar with the K-3 Literacy Essentials document, I'm just going to share something really quickly that you may not have noticed. So the way the Essentials document is set up is there are 10 essentials, and those 10 essentials are listed there with 5 bullets under each essential. But this final page is one that we don't really look at a lot as educators, I think, because it's very tiny print. It's not easy to read. It's just references. But when I say it's just references, this is that research. 20% of the document is just citing all of the different pieces of research, all of the science of reading that went into compiling this document. I highly encourage you, if you ever feel like, hey, I'm not sure about that essential, or I want to know more about that, feel free to check out those endnotes, check out those references, see if you can find the article yourself, dig into it, and see what you think. I also hope that we're starting to think about those questions like, hey, and then fill in the blank. Is my curriculum, the resource that I'm using, the worksheet, the intervention, the lesson, is it based on the science of reading? Does it reflect good reading research? And when we think about our district curriculum, we should be looking for those places where it connects really well with the literacy essentials, where we're finding those places where we can implement those essential instructional practices to deliver the curriculum. And then just as a reminder, Wayne Risa is here to partner with your school. If you feel as if you would like for us to come to your building and do a session on the science of reading, an overview like this one, or going deeper into one or more areas, we are happy to do that. That is a service we provide to Wayne County. Some books that I referenced in this text, Shifting the Balance, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, and No More Independent Reading Without Support. Those are books that definitely embrace the science of reading and would be good to read. I also included there as a bonus, The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek. That is not the science of reading, but it's a fun read. And if you are a leader, I definitely suggest it. And it's one where I grabbed a story to share with you today. I also wanted to let you know that the reading teacher that is available to you for free, and I put some of the articles that are in there, they're over there on the side so that you can see they have Ari and Dr. Mesner, these names that hopefully sound familiar to you if you're steeped in reading research. Lots of good stuff to read. And then, of course, the Wayne Risa Learning Blitz. These are all free. If you subscribe to my YouTube channel, you'll get notified every time I post a new one. So we record these sessions. Sometimes we re-record them if we forget to push record or we want to say something maybe a little clearer. But in general, they're posted within a few days of the original presentation. So feel free to sign up for that. And then we do have foundational skills in oral language this week, as well as foundational skills in phonemic awareness. Sign up if you'd like to come, or if you just want a recording of the Blitz itself. You don't have to attend to get that recording. Also, just to let you know that the state has put aside lots of money. I believe it's $4 million for letters training. And as of today, the form was still up on MDE's website. I know Judy's dropping that link in the chat for you. If you're interested in that, that is an intensive dive into the science of reading and would be a great fit if you're really interested in this topic. So then, of course, I'll leave you with the reminder that literacyessentials.org is your place for all things literacy essentials. Encourage you to check those out. And even though we just had the chance to really get to the tip of that iceberg, and then as we think back about those tools for learning that we gathered at the beginning and how we were going to disrupt that pattern of the way in which humans forget things. And by doing that, just maybe as you go throughout your afternoon, if you would maybe take those notes from today's session and look at them one more time in the next hour. Just one more time, just read through what you wrote. And then tomorrow morning, maybe take one more chance to look through it. And that should help you better recall this information later. And when we can remember it, we can apply it. With that, thank you all for coming. We hope you enjoyed this session. I know that it was a lot of information. Have a wonderful day.